So the entire documentary is looking at the kind of chain reaction happening for civet coffee farming. So it starts with essentially what is civet coffee, and where does it come from, but also what are the big implications of that. So a lot of research to date on civet coffee has looked at the animal welfare impacts of the caged farming. So there's quite a lot of research showing that obviously the animal welfare conditions are not brilliant, far from it, and how that is causing irrevocable individual harms to the animals that are caged. Our documentary wants to go beyond that. Of course, that's a very important consideration for us, but we want to show that actually there are bigger ecological impacts to the civet coffee trade, primarily because it is spreading across civet range countries. So we have it starting in Indonesia, but now you can go to Vietnam and try civet coffee. It's farmed in Vietnam, it's farmed in the Philippines, in southern China, like in India, it goes throughout the civets range. But because palm civets are not considered by the IUCN to be endangered or at risk, there's very little attention given to civet coffee in the conservation space. But as well as conservation and the ecological impacts of overharvesting, which we are seeing throughout several regions in Southeast Asia, we also have the risk of zoonosis because it's putting humans and civets into greater and greater proximities, and the products itself is coming from civet feces. And so you're having a lot of people interacting very closely on a daily basis with civets that are stressed, that have injuries, that are immunocompromised, and they're handling their feces and their other bodily fluids. And then, of course, we have the kind of peripheral effects of snaring and encroachment into habitats, things like that. So our documentary is going to trace what civet coffee is, how it's advertised, how it features in urban tourism, how it features in rural tourism, because we're finding as well that civet coffee is being heavily depended upon by the tourism industry. So tourism is actually a very big market driver for this product, and it tends to be domestic tourism as well, which again is something that hasn't really been explored in the literature. So we're going to Vietnam. We've chosen Vietnam because the Austin civet lives there, and they are an endangered species, which are being impacted by increased snaring, and civet coffee is now surrounding their range.
Which species again? I want to look it up. I might not know this guy.
The Austin civet, so it's OWSTONS. Yeah. So
I have never studied this one. So that's a cool one. Oh
yeah.
This one's one of my favorite civets yet. I did not know they were this cool. It's only been a name in the species list so far to me.
Yeah, they are brilliant. And so one of our trustees at the Civet Project manages the captive breeding program for them in Europe. And another one of our trustees was previously working at Save Vietnam's Wildlife, which is one of the locations that we'll be filming at. And they rescue civets, and they also have the only in situ breeding program for that species. So we'll be talking to veterinary staff, we'll be showing the camera very close-up images of what the snares look like and the types of injuries that they can cause. We'll be talking to the rescue staff about the number of civets of all different species that are coming through their sanctuary, and the role of civet coffee in that as well. I think I've just about covered everything.
This guy looks like a insectivore, or actually it's called the invertivore because they eat things that don't have. So maybe are they used for this civet coffee?
So
I'm just talking about the this one
Austin
species I was looking at real quick.
Yeah. So the Austin civet has been found in civet coffee farms, but it is protected. So research has also shown that civet coffee farms are being used as kind of ghost facilities. So they're being set up as civet coffee farms, but they're actually being used to smuggle endangered species like the Eastern civet into the illegal pet trade. So you see a kind of merger of trades.
So you got, if I read this correctly, you got some herbivorous, frugivorous civets actually eating coffee. Tourists love that. Then
Hmm.
are making a bunch of coffee anyway and calling it civet coffee, but it's not. And then you have some of these cooler civets there being bred. Tourists like that too, but they're not actually eating any coffee and pooping out coffee beans because they don't eat coffee. But these farms are now, yeah, breeding centers for and trade centers, even if they're not being used for coffee.
Yes, they tend not to be breeding them because breeding civets is quite difficult, and they reach a much higher price per head. So that tends to be a separate trade. But what is happening is the very rare species or the very beautiful species that get caught incidentally when they're going out snaring for civets, and they catch these ones that don't eat coffee beans, but they're beautiful. They bring them into the civet coffee farms, and then they sell them to the civet pet breeders to then sell on to higher end clients. What might be
All
helpful
right.
is actually if we start with Matt just explaining how you've actually engaged with civets in your research to give a bit of context as
Mm-hmm.
to where your knowledge kind of what lens you're bringing to civets.
Okay, cool. Um, yeah, so my name's Matthew Luskin. I'm a wildlife researcher at the University of Queensland. I'm in the Department of the Environment, and I've spent 15 years studying wildlife in Asia. I focus on one particular method, which is using camera traps to study animals that are otherwise hard to see. Many animals are hard to see in rainforests because your visibility is very low. There's a bunch of vegetation. So these cameras are really useful. It's also really useful for studying animals that are active at night because these cameras take pictures with an infrared, so the animals rarely can see what's going on. So you get pictures of nocturnal species, and it's much easier to study them that way. And over the last 10, 15 years now, have set thousands and thousands of cameras and left them out for many, many, many thousands of nights. We call one trap left out for one night a trap night. And if you add up all of our data sets together, we have nearly 1 million trap nights. So this is really how we study cryptic wildlife in rainforest today. And my lab focuses on that in Asia. So civets are a species we've really are interested in because number one, they're what is called hyper diverse guild within the carnivora family. So you have more than 20 species of civets in Asia living in rainforests that otherwise look the same. And usually that doesn't happen because you have competitive exclusion where one animal is better competitor, so they exclude the other animals. But for civets, they've actually diversified into all these little niches. Even though they're all carnivora, they eat a variety of things. So some species are totally herbivorous. Some are folivars. They specialize on leaves. Some are frugivorous. They specialize on fruit. Others are invertebrates, where they eat worms and things like that. Others are insectivorous, where they eat insects above ground. And some are generalists. They eat everything. So they also are active at different times of day. Some are nocturnal, some are diurnal. Others are terrestrial on the ground. Others are very strictly arboreal. They're always up in the trees. So they're really just an amazing group. We often work on them as well because they are vectors of zoonotic diseases, so people care. There's 100 really interesting animals in an Asian rainforest that we could study at any given time. And we often cycle through them based on what people want to know about at that given moment. And so since COVID-19, people have been really interested to know where civets are, in what densities, what explains their population sizes. so that they can model the potential for a zoonotic disease jump to humans. And I guess it's a good time to define a zoonotic disease. So this is a disease that can be carried by both humans and animals, particularly wildlife. So very famous examples would be rabies or anthrax. These are diseases that spread through animal populations normally, and when they jump to humans, they can have really horrible outcomes. But other diseases are things like COVID-19 that have, very low mortality rate relative to rabies, but still high enough to cause significant concern. And so there is one COVID variant, SARS, which I think the outbreak was early 2000s, and that was actually a jump from a common palm civet to humans in East Asia, around, I think it was in Taiwan and then Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken. And I think they traced that jump to a farmed civet, or I'm not sure if it was farmed or pet trade. And so that really sparked a lot of concern. There's still unknown about where COVID-19 came from, but in the wildlife markets where there was civets, pangolins, bats, and a bunch of other animals that might carry COVID-19, they were all, potentially intermixing, and it's unclear how this initial jump happened, but it's not inconceivable that civets were involved. So for our specific research papers on civets, we usually focus using camera traps to look at their habitat associations and which areas have the highest densities. So we look at, which species are associated with disturbed areas where humans like to also live, because where humans and animals overlap is where you're more likely to see zoonotic disease spread, as opposed to maybe deep in the middle of a rainforest where there's very few humans. The chance of us zoonotic disease jumping is very low. So we identify those kind of habitat associations. We make maps about where these animals are likely to be and in which densities. And then we communicate that to the organizations such as the IUCN and CITES. So the IUCN is the group that decides if an animal is endangered or not a specific concern for conservation. And CITES is the group that regulates trade in animals. Yeah, so that's my background in civets.
That's yeah, that was, I've got to say, you ticked off a good few questions there as well, so that's perfect. I guess jumping, just keeping this rolling. You've obviously mentioned the specific risks. You've given a definition. In the context of this specific documentary, would be looking at the coffee trade, but would also be looking at the meat trade or the bushmeat trade, and to go into some of these markets to look at this level of interaction with the species. So would you consider this being a potential interaction or interface where zoonotic disease could be transferred, and is this the type of situation and example that you'd expect for zoonotic disease transfer?
Yeah, wildlife markets are places where there's an extremely high risk of zoonotic disease transfer for a variety of reasons. One, you have a whole bunch of animals that rarely interact in nature, interacting. So you have the opportunity for a disease to spread to a new host where it can either change or grow faster or slower. And so that's one more step in the pathway to getting to humans oftentimes. Let's say it jumps from, civets to macaque monkey, and then there's macaque monkeys in every village of Southeast Asia, eating trash, interacting with people. People are catching the babies, making them pets. And so you can imagine how that can be a one stepping stone in that path from a disease being in nature into humans. There's also, blood and other fluids being interchanged, touching humans. So that's a clear place where disease jump could occur. And then animals are being moved around a lot. And so you could get a disease that might have not been a problem in one area, and it spreads to a different climate, different area, because the animal was moved for sale in a different country, and that leading to a new outbreak or conditions in which that disease can spread where it originally could not. So yes, wildlife markets in general are a huge concern. Civets are often there. My experience is they're not a preferred meat, but doesn't mean that people won't eat them, and there aren't enclaves of people who do really prefer civet meat. I haven't come across that, but I'm not saying it's not possible. It's the main hunting method in Southeast Asia is snaring, and snares are indiscriminate in what they get. Anything that gets their leg in those wires is probably going to be trapped, and if it's big enough, it'll oftentimes, cut their own leg off. And if it's not big enough, like a civet, oftentimes be stuck there when the hunters come. And so I think many times civets are victims of snares that were set for other animals, such as a pig or a deer that's better for bushmeat. So that's how I think a lot of time they end up in the markets. Doesn't mean people aren't also trapping specifically for civets, but I just haven't come across it. That doesn't mean that's not happening.
So we're finding with Civet Coffee that civets are, well, usually it's the common palm civets are specifically targeted. And sometimes that's because they're considered a farm pest because they're coming into plantations. And so where usually or previously the farmers might go out and trap and kill as a kind of vermin pest. Now, because they can get some money for them from the civet coffee producers, they're trapping them alive. So we have different trap methods that are coming into play because of civet coffee. I was just wondering what your thoughts were about civet coffee becoming so prevalent across Southeast Asia and what the ramifications of that might be, both for ecology and zoonosis.
Yeah, that's a great question. The ramifications I am concerned about are, one, the poor conditions in which these animals live. These are wild animals that are probably extremely stressed out and unhappy about living in captivity. Also, when they're stressed, they're more likely to be zoonotic disease hosts and to shed the virus. So those things actually are interrelated, the disease spread and the condition of the animal. And then also there's just the ethical point of it. I think it's unethical. So those are my main concerns. For common palm civet, there's not that many civets that eat fruits, especially coffee berries. Common palm civet is one. Common palm civet are pretty common. So I'm not really concerned about the conservation implications of it. But I'm much more concerned about the other civets that are threatened being captured because they live and interact in the same areas that regular common palm civets are. So that's the conservation point of view. It's the other civets I'd probably be a little bit more worried about. They're not a big pest. They don't eat very much. There's not that many of them. So that's not a strong concern. Although if you had a really small farm, it's possible that that would be a concern for a farmer. Yeah, the spread outside of Bali to some other areas is interesting, makes sense because it's a draw for people who have no idea about what's going on. And oftentimes these farms have a variety of animals and tourists like to see it. I've been to with them before. I've seen people be like, oh, this is really cool, and not understand that as they stick their head in looking at literally a fruit bat right next to a common palm civet, that's just about the best situation you can get for disease spill over. So yeah, it's concerning, I think, especially for a zoonotic disease point of view.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well, because you also think about the dispersal of humans and you have people traveling from all over the world, and they might be visiting several different islands, they might be visiting several different regions, um, like even different countries, and interacting with lots of different animals in settings that are, like you said, very high potential for spillover of disease, and then they're then traveling elsewhere. So we saw that with COVID as well. So that's yeah, it's a very good point about tourists being kind of prime place for spreading disease. So given that there is this concern about civets and disease, we know that they're vectors of SARS. Some might say, well, if they're common and they're easy to catch and they hold disease, shouldn't we just cull them? What would be your response about removing civets from the ecosystem in such a way?
I think there's okay. They're never in high densities that I've ever observed. Nothing concerning. And the chance of a disease spillover occurring is just so much higher when they're captured. And so free living civets, I think, are not a threat and should not be culled. There's no science I'm aware of that would support that, even if you're trying to reduce zoonotic disease at this point. But there are sometimes also civets in and around cities, including in like urban parks. I think instead of culling, the appropriate thing to do there would be to capture them from time to time and test them for zoonotic diseases. That sounds like the appropriate preventative, cautious intervention before just removing them. But even then, and I'm just talking about removing them from actual cities or maybe inside villages, even then, if they were removed from cities, that's not going to put a dent in the civet population. That's a very small amount of animals. So it's not a big concern to me. If that's what's going to ameliorate concerns, it's not ideal, but it would not be, I could understand why people wanted to do that. I think the proper way to go about it would be to first see if they carry any concerning diseases. Also, that's a way to learn about what's going on.
Yeah, monitoring is so important. That's a very good point. So I get my final question. I don't know if Jack's got any more, but my final question is, would you mind just briefly summarizing the importance of civets within their ecosystem? So what role do they play? This is where we want to be able to have like that ecology lens come in, because I'm not an ecologist. I can talk forever about civet trade, but it would be great to get your expertise about what civets are actually doing in the wild and why should we want to protect them there.
Okay, there are so many civet species, and that family in itself is a miraculous hyperdiverse guild that bodes for that presents lots of interesting ecology questions and should be protected for themselves because they themselves are an amazing group of animals. They're beautiful and they do an amazing variety of behaviors and interactions within a rainforest. A few of those civets are herbivorous or frugivorous and disperse seeds. Those include the common palm civet and binturong. And both common palm civet and binturong exist in forest edges where many other animals are not. So these are other animals that disperse seeds. So they're often the last ones around to disperse seeds and therefore become really important to the plant communities and trees in these areas. And those areas now represent the vast majority of forests remaining in Asia because over 75% of the remaining forest in Asia is within 1 kilometer of an edge. So there's basically only these degraded forest left. The really remote areas, they have a much wider variety of animals to disperse seeds, and in those situations, common palm civet and binturong might not be so important. The insectivorous civets and the civets that eat small mammals, they do play a role keeping keeping in check insect populations and bird populations, but they are probably not keystone species. In fact, they themselves are, I think, the interesting bit of those food webs, like how there can be so many surviving on such a limited resource.
That's
yeah,
perfect.
that's my answer, but it
Yeah.
wasn't very good. No.
No. Honestly, that was perfect, because the other thing is that common palm civets and binturong, which you've just named as being the more important ecological species groups within the vivarid family, they are the species that we see most commonly in civet farms for civet coffee. And although binturong throughout much of their range are protected, they still do end up to some degree in these facilities, even though that is very much illegal. Whereas common palm civets don't have that type of protection. And there seems to be a misconception as well that because they can exist in these edge areas, and they're seen more frequently than other species, that they may be even more abundant than actually they might be in other areas.
Preventing zoonotic diseases for humans should be as important, if not more important, than conservation. So like that's a big enough reason to make them protected, is because they have a threat of spreading zoonotic diseases. That's not how it works right now, which to me is mind-blowing, given that we just had COVID-19. But that's the way it is. Like I think all species that are at high risk of spreading zoonotic disease should be on like CITES 1 and listen on some other, like CITES is a really good, you can have a domestic, they have domestic versions of CITES 2 where it says you just can't manage these species, you can't keep them in captivity, you can't kill them, usually because of the conservation status. We should include because they have a high threat of spreading zoonotic disease to people. That doesn't exist right now, but I think it should.